I'm hoping that everyone can see the screen. Welcome to our fourth Flourish tea break. This is going to be a webinar on dual axes. My name's Lindsay. I'll be taking you through this today for the next half an hour. I'm joined by my colleagues Louisa, Ilias and Richard, who are on the chat. So if you have any questions as I go through the slides, please just put them in the chat and they will respond to you. And the whole session is being recorded and will be available on YouTube afterwards. So if you want to refer back to anything, you can, or if you know anyone that has missed it and might find it interesting, then it will be there for people to look at. And we will also make the slides available. So let's dive in. Dual axis charts. Why do people tend to use charts with axis on the left and the right side? So these are the kind of most common use cases. Mainly people either use it to plot data series with the same measure but very different magnitudes, and so it's easier to compare the different data series if they're on different scaled axes. Secondly, people tend to use it to plot completely different measures on each axis to show a relationship between those two measures. And thirdly, they can use it to plot the same measure, but to have a second axis to do a different chart type. And sometimes this can help with the visual appeal of your chart or help explain something more easily. So the first two, I would say, are not normally best practice. I wouldn't encourage you to use dual axis charts. They're normally quite confusing and hard for people to read. And in this seminar, I'll take you through some of those pitfalls, some of the alternatives, and also all the options available in Flourish for dual axes. And then at the end, I will take you through some options for the third set of examples, so using two different chart types. So my first example is using the same measure but very different magnitudes. I'm going to use our trusted friend, the UK Energy Trends dataset, which we have been using for our webinars. And if you've been to a few in the last couple of weeks, you'll be very familiar with this dataset. And so I'm just going to swap out into the Flourish editor and show you the data and how to make a dual axis chart in Flourish. So this is a chart that you may be familiar with, as I said, if you came to the webinars before. It's plotting energy production for the different energy types. And as you can see, it's quite nice for dual axis demonstration because there's 4 energy types down here that are kind of have very small numbers, and then these energy types that have large production numbers, and that is stretching the scale. So it's hard to see the patterns in these energy types. And so this might be where you choose to go to your chart type and change it to a dual axis. So if I do it here, it brings in this extra scale and it's plotting the larger numbers on this side and the smaller numbers on this side. And you specify how many you want to be plotted on each axis. So here I've specified 3 because that plots the 3 bigger ones on one axis and the other 4 on the axis with a much smaller scale. But as you can see, doing this makes it very confusing. It's very hard to see which line belongs to which scale. You can see this increasing more for the smaller energy production types. But all of this, you know, I don't think people would be picking up these patterns if they were to look at it. So I would always suggest doing, separate charts for these sorts of things where there's lots of data series. And here it's very easy in Flourish. You can go to a grid of charts and it will plot them all separately. Oh, sorry, and I need to switch it back to a single axis. It will plot them all separately, and you can, if you want to, just show the patterns, so they're increasing, these ones are increasing, these ones are falling, by having the different scales for the x-axis. You can do this in the grid of charts, and you can say to have different y-axes across the grid. If you're more interested in them having the same y-axis, you can switch it back on again and see how they compare to each other. So this is a much better alternative to having two different axes. But if you're absolutely wedded to having a dual axis, I'm going to take you through some of the things you should think about when designing your chart. So for this, I'm just going to focus on petrol and wind, solar and hydro, because these are the two series from the last chart that are kind of most extreme in scale. And as you can see, one of your main issues is that your tick marks and your grid lines don't align because you haven't got the same number the same number of ticks between the different axes. So to fix this, to begin with, you could start this axis from 0. So here you can just start it from 0, and that will give you the same number of tick marks, and then the grid lines will align. So that makes it look much nicer. Another issue with dual axes is it's still really hard to see which series is plotting to which axis. So I would suggest colouring your axis in the same colour as your series, but you should be mindful that when writing in coloured text, it needs to be accessible. And these colours aren't very accessible. They're too light for people to kind of read. So I'm going to change these colours to be more easy to see. So I'm going to give I'm going to give the winds I'm going to swap these around. The petrol, the blue colour, and the wind and solar and hydro, the red colour, because it's much easier to see. And then I'm going to label my axes in these colours. So I am going to put petrol as my axis title, and I am going to put these in the same colour as the blue. So if I just put in my hex codes here for that blue, which luckily I already know, 7C9. It colours it in that colour, and I can also do the same thing for the tick labels. So I can put them in that blue colour again. And then this all starts to look much nicer. And I can do the same for the other y-axes. I can put it in that red. So I'm just going to abbreviate this for speed. And I'm going to put that in the red colour. And I like it bold, and the labels as well. So we have FF. And then that's bold as well. So now it's much easier for a person to see that this reads to this axis and this series reads to this axis. We then have another problem in that where these lines cross is very misleading. It suggests there's some kind of relationship here when there isn't. It's just random that they cross here. And if you were to change this scale to go up to 10, then it would cross at different points. So this brings me back to the point at the beginning, is that this can just be very confusing and misleading. And so I would strongly suggest that you just did it as one axis on separate charts, and changed your x-axis one axis on separate charts, yeah. And then you can grid of charts, sorry, I'm just going to change this so that you don't have the same y-axis, so you can see that this one's going up while this one's going down. And also in this particular instance, the years are the same on the x-axis, so I would suggest plotting them one below each other, which you can do by fixing the columns in the grid of charts, and then they will go below each other, and then you can read up the years to see how they relate by year, and obviously also change all your formatting back on your axes so that they read to the same thing. So the same conclusion, coming back to having two separate charts is normally always a better option. Another way to resolve this issue of not using a dual axis chart, and I'll move on to another example, is to find a measure where you can compare the two axes on the two series on one single axis. So for this particular example, I suggest using a percentage change on the year, and then these numbers are more similar in scale and so easier to compare. So if I change it to plot the percentage change instead, you can see they're not so different in the scale. And I'll just so we're clear in our number formatting, I'll just say that those are a percent. But then I would also suggest making some kind of different design features on here to show people that petrol is kind of negative below the 0 line, and wind, solar and hydro are above the 0 line. And by doing this in your you can do this in your axis highlights, so you can make the 0 line more prominent so that people's attention is drawn to that the numbers going negative. You could also do a range highlight to draw even more attention to the negative number by putting it in the x-axis highlight here, and that will color red. And also, so then you're drawing people's attention to this kind of negative area and petrol's falling. And also, we have a really exciting new feature of annotations on line bar and pie charts coming, and so I would suggest using annotation to also reinforce this message. So you can put this in a story, which I have already done here, because this is where you can add your annotation. So petrol production keeps falling. This is added in an annotation using this little black pen. And here you can add your annotation by clicking on a spot, putting in what you want, and you can make different choices on whether you want a marker or a connector, and you can also change the color so that it relates to your series. And then another nice feature of the story player is you could introduce your different series of so that you can step people through the two different series. So that's kind of a nice way of stepping through a message. So that's another way around not using a dual axis chart. I'm now going to move on to my second example, which I mentioned earlier, which is using two measures on different axes, so completely different measures. So it's not a scaling thing, but it could be as well. And for this example, I have used India's GDP and life expectancy and plotted them using all those little tricks before, so making sure your grid lines are aligned and your axes are coloured to show that they are both rising. And again, you can kind of see this pattern. It's not a horrible dual axis chart, but we do have this problem of being misleading. So just to show this, if I changed life expectancy scale to 100 instead of 80, life expectancy would fall, and then the life expectancy series would fall, and then it would cross here. And that just shows that there's no relationship between these two, but it's just quite confusing. And where these two measures are placed is completely at random, depending on the scales that you choose to show. So again, that same issue arises with this, with using two different measures. Also, if you wanted to add more countries, it starts to get very complicated and confusing, a bit like the energy trends one. So I've just done another example here that has China on there as well. So it's got China's GDP and life expectancy. When you start to add on these more and more countries, it starts to become harder and harder to see the different relationships between the countries' two metrics. And your eyes focused on this kind of China GDP. This also changes the scale. And yeah, it just becomes much harder to understand the relationship between these two measures for different countries. So my suggestion would be, when you've got two measures, you should actually use a scatter plot. So here I have used the scatter template, and you can, I put one measure on the y-axis, so Indian life expectancy versus Indian GDP. And here you can see that same relationship where it's positively correlated, so they're increasing together over time. But it is much easier to see that actually they increase much, life expectancy increases much quicker at lower levels of GDP, and then it starts to plateau. That's much harder to see in that dual axis chart. Couple of little additional tips for here. So at the moment in the pop-up, it's just plotting the two numbers, but in the data it would be really helpful to add the year, so when people hover over it, they can see what year that dot is for. And also you could connect the series by country, so I've put India in here, and that gives a kind of sense of direction. So you can see the direction of the dots progressing as the years go on. So this is 2015. And then we can also see, oh, sorry, one last thing. It can be really nice to add a trend line to a scatter. So it kind of gives you a kind of linear relationship between the two. So here in the trend lines, you can add a trend line to these two, to this chart. But also trend lines are really helpful when trying to compare the different countries as well. So if we were to use a dual axis chart and add more countries onto this, we would be adding 2 lines for every country. So if we wanted to add China and Brazil to this, we'd be having 6 series. But if we have a scatter, we can add China as its own series and Brazil as its own series. And it's much easier to see how these patterns compare and contrast. And this is how the kind of trend lines really help show the differences across the countries. So here you can see a much steeper trend line for India, but that's because their GDP has not gone up by as much as China and Brazil. By plotting it on the scatter, you can see that all these countries, the same thing seems to happen, where life expectancy increases much quicker at lower levels of GDP and then plateaus. But also you can see that Brazil is much more erratic than the other countries. So this is a much nicer way of showing two measures on one chart. And again, you can kind of add little bits of extra design to help people understand the story you're trying to tell them. So again, you could put an axis highlight in here and say, maybe after 800, I think it's billion GDP, that's when it starts to plateau. So you can put a line in here. And again, you could go into the story player. You can create a story from this. And you could add an annotation to here. So I can click it here and I can say life expectancy tends to plateau after this point. And again, showing these kind of features, you can take off your markers, take down your markers, or change your radiuses, all different sorts of animation options for this. So yeah, a scatter chart is definitely a better alternative to dual axes with lots of different series and two different measures. So onto my final, the final example, which is using dual axes to construct two different chart types. And this is normally fine, it doesn't cause too much confusion like the other two options. So I'm going back to my energy trends data here, and I've just added in the data a total line. So this is all of these added up, and it's being plotted here, and it extends the scale because it's the total of all of these. But now I might want to show how these add up to compose the total, and this is quite a nice use of the dual axis option. So you can go to dual axis lines and columns and stack them, and now they will add up to your total, and you can see what builds to the total. It's also a nice way of getting numbers on both sides of your axis. So that's kind of a quick trick if you would like numbers on both sides of your grid lines. But one thing just to be careful of is not to use a legend filter in dual axis charts. So to show the issue with this, if you take you want to take total out, it changes the order of the series, and it starts plotting coal on the right hand axis instead, and it also changes your the order of your colors. So it's a definite no-no. Definitely avoid having legend filters in dual axis, and you can turn it off in here in the legend tab, so that can't happen. So, okay, so that's one option. The other option is last example of using, oh sorry, one other thing I was going to show you here is you can change this around to a different type of two charts. So one now, instead of having stacked bars, you can have areas, which might actually make it a bit easier to see. So there's a couple of options there on your dual axis tabs. And a second example of using two different chart types on a dual axis, again using the energy trends data, but now I have just taken the amount for 2019 for the different energy types, and I've added a kind of random data set for target. So here just added a target for those different energy types in 2019. And if you had just a single axis bar chart, it's a bit hard to see that the amount of petrol is over the target, and the amount of natural gas is under the target. So this is a nice case for using dual axis again. So we can go to our dual axis and columns grouped here. And I've obviously been playing around with this before, but normally it will put your lines in like this, as a line and a bar chart, but these things aren't connected, so that's why it's best to turn your lines off, so you just have your dots, and then you can play around with your dots as well, so you can make them bigger. So that's just a nice way of showing. It's much easier now to see that petrol is above its target, natural gas is below, energy is bioenergy is below, and so on. So that's a kind of nice little way of using dual axis. And lastly, it's also kind of a good little quirk if you wanted to use a grid of charts, but with two different axes, two different chart types on both. So again, I can show you here. You could put your lines back in here and fiddle around with that, and you can have your different chart types here. If you wanted to have an area chart instead of a bar chart, then you could choose area there. But it just shows you how you can build up different chart types in a grid of charts as well, and mix and match them. So that is the end of my dual axis seminar. I hope you found it interesting. I am 2 minutes early, so hopefully if you had any questions, everyone at the Flourish team have been able to answer them. And this this presentation with all the kind of issues and resolutions will all be available after the tea break, along with the recording. So thank you so much for joining me. There will be another webinar next Tuesday and all Tuesdays after that. So hopefully we will see you back again then. Okay, thank you. Bye.